My name is Elizabeth Connolly, and I'm presenting my research on identifying robust investments for disaster preparedness in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This work was completed with the help of Professor James Lambert at the University of Virginia and Professor Jose Gomes at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Emergency management consists of 4 phases, where mitigation and preparedness focus on reducing the negative consequences of disasters, as well as ensuring effective coordination during incident response. Planning for preparedness can drastically decrease costs and loss of life due to a broad range of disaster scenarios. In 2005, Brazil, along with 150 other nations, attended the World Conference for Disaster Reduction, where participants agreed on the objective of significantly reducing the social, economic, and environmental losses due to disasters. But it has really only been the past few years that Brazil has begun to realize the importance of emergency planning and risk management. Brazil is prone to natural disasters, including heavy rainfall that causes flooding and landslides. In January 2011, flooding took over 900 lives, making it the deadliest natural disaster in Brazil's history, as well as causing Brazil to be ranked 3rd in disaster mortalities in 2011. As a response, the United Nations announced the opening of the Center of Excellence for Disaster Risk Reduction to be located in Rio de Janeiro. Natural disasters, like floods and landslides, are particularly devastating to the slum or favela regions of Brazil. These areas are especially vulnerable, yet Brazil historically has done a poor job of allocating resources to reduce the disaster risk in these favelas. This case study is focused on Rio de Janeiro, in part because of the large favela population in the state. More than 1 million people, that's 20% of the country's population, live in favelas in Rio de Janeiro. On top of this, Rio is susceptible to a radiological disaster if there was to be a malfunction at the Angra nuclear power plant. Next summer, Rio will also serve as one of the host cities for the FIFA World Cup, as well as hosting the Olympics in 2016, during which time over 1 million tourists are anticipated to be staying in and around the city. Large events, such as the World Cup and Olympics, not only make Rio a potential target for terrorism, but also strain the resources and infrastructure such that a natural disaster could be even more catastrophic than under normal circumstances. Thus, Brazil, and Rio de Janeiro in particular, could benefit from a scenario-based multi-criteria decision analysis to identify and prioritize investments for emergency preparedness under a number of possible disaster scenarios. The purpose of this work is to demonstrate the application of this integrated scenario analysis and MCDA to support resource allocation, investments, and decision-making for a wide range of emergency planning and response stakeholders. The technical approach begins with the identification of investment alternatives for prioritization. We must also identify competing criteria important for the decision-making. The criteria are weighted according to relative importance. An assessment matrix is created such that each entry indicates how well an initiative addresses a criterion, with a value of 0 being assigned if it does not address the criterion, 1/3 if it somewhat addresses a criterion, 2/3 if it does address, and 1 if it strongly addresses the criterion. Next, we identify possible emergent conditions and use them to build scenarios of interest. Under each scenario, the relative importance of each criterion is reassessed, and the new weight is varied according to whether the importance increases somewhat, stays the same, decreases somewhat, or decreases. Using the weights under each scenario, a value function is employed to rank the investment initiatives, where the initiatives scoring closest to 100 have the highest priority. The changes in rank from the baseline scenario under the various other scenarios reveal those that are most disruptive to the prioritization. Now that I have explained the approach, I will go through the demonstration for Rio de Janeiro. 37 preparedness initiatives were identified for this evaluation. Some are more general, like increasing stockpiles of drinking water, food, or emergency kits, while others are more focused on educating the favela population about the prevalent natural hazards that affect their area. The more general initiatives were adopted from a study by Aisa Parlock and colleagues on the U.S. National Capital Region and Department of Homeland Security initiatives, which was published in 2011. The others are based on international initiatives from the Hyogo framework, as well as ones tailored specifically for Brazil. The 10 performance criteria identified are based on those used by the Parlock paper on disaster preparedness. The criteria include public health and safety at the top of the list, followed by cost, information sharing, public preparedness and planning, environmental concerns, coordination across states and localities, and emergency responders, capacities for mass sheltering and evacuation, the role of the private sector, and finally, innovation, learning, and adaptation in emergency planning. High influence was assigned to 3 of the criteria: public health and safety, cost, and environmental considerations. The rest were considered to have medium influence. The 10 by 37 Matrix A was populated with quantitative assessments of how well the initiatives addressed the criteria. 25 emergent conditions were identified from reports such as the Hyogo Framework for Action and the Red Cross Analysis of Disaster Risk Reduction. The scenarios include natural disasters, a radiological event, and the upcoming Olympics and World Cup. For each scenario, the influence of the criteria were reevaluated, resulting in the 10 by 7 Matrix W. These values were used to score the initiatives and create a ranking under each scenario. The initiatives that were ranked top in at least one scenario include improving the interoperability of emergency communications among first responders, improving planning for evacuation, and increasing capabilities for radiological decontamination. While those are all highly ranked, the last is the most robust to changes in prioritization. This is shown in the figure by the shorter length of the whisker, coming from the triangle that marks the ranking and baseline scenario. We also found that although increasing the availability of temporary and long-term housing was a low priority in the baseline scenario, it increased dramatically in ranking under the radiological disaster scenario. Similarly, we found that increasing the number of volunteers experienced the greatest decrease in rank, occurring in the World Cup scenario. The World Cup scenario was indeed the most disruptive to the prioritization of investments. Heavy rainfall seems to pose the least threat to the baseline preferences. We also concluded that improving planning for evacuation was the most robust initiative under the scenarios considered, as well as being highly ranked. While this work has revealed highly ranked and robust initiatives, as well as influential scenarios that would be recommended for further study, the purpose of this effort was to apply an existing method of scenario-based preference analysis to identify scenarios of particular concern for disaster planning in Brazil. This tool can also be used by decision makers themselves so that they can incorporate their own ideas and preferences to determine the prioritization of a variety of investments. This decision-aiding tool was built in an Excel workbook that can be used by decision makers themselves. Stakeholders can choose which criteria to include by checking a box. Also, they can add others. Next, they can incorporate their preferences by choosing the relative importance of the criteria. Initiatives can also be chosen for inclusion or exclusion in the analysis. The stakeholders can decide for themselves how well the investment alternatives address the criteria, choosing from a drop-down menu. Scenarios are constructed from emergent conditions. The importance of the criteria are reassessed, also from a drop-down menu. Finally, the results are presented in terms of the scores and the rankings. Finally, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the other students and professors that have helped me to be able to customize this tool for disaster planning in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you for your time.